Hello everyone, good evening. May I kindly request you to find a seat, please? Thank you. Good evening and welcome to the Bangalore International Center. BIC, established in 2005, is a privately enabled public purpose institution for informed conversations, exchange of ideas, arts, and culture. This evening's program is Secrets and Lines, a short history of boundaries in India, the last of the 2026 Obaid Siddiqi lectures delivered by Dr. Samira Sheikh. This event is presented by the archives at NCBS, and I'd like to, before I invite Professor Shashi up to introduce the organization and the lecture a little bit more, may I please request the audience to put your phones on silent or switch them off. The lecture will be followed by a Q&A, so kindly hold on to your questions and comments until then. I'd now like to invite Professor Shashi Thuttupalli, faculty at NCBS, to introduce the event.
Thank you. Thank you to BIC, first of all, on behalf of the NCBS, and on behalf of the NCBS, welcome all of you to this evening. It's really wonderful to see such a nice turnout today. The NCBS is the National Center for Biological Sciences, and I want to say it's the premier institute for the study of biology or life, more broadly, in India. And it's been in existence for about 35, 40 years now. And I want to say that, you know, the mandate, of course, is biology, as you might guess from the name itself, spanning from the molecules of life to ecology, ecosystems, and so on and so forth. But what's very unique about the institute that we have is rather than interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, as the fashion is to say about many things these days, NCBS is a place of indiscipline, I want to say, right? So there's a spark of a spark of crazy that brings together a motley crew of people, and this means the following, in my view. It means that even from the very initiation, this center has been populated by chemists, physicists, mathematicians, computer scientists, and so on, all interested in studying this thing of biology, right? And it really takes that village to tackle this problem head on. And particularly in times like this and where we are going in the future, this bodes very well for a place like NCBS, that it has been started like that and continues in that spirit. And it's within that very same spirit that we have the kind of work that Samira will tell us today about the coming together of humanities and history and arts and so on within this biology center, named after the chair professorship, named after the founder, Obaid Siddiqi, who was a neurogeneticist, who had a very broad vision, not only for biology and of biology, but also its place in society and so on. And sort of it is to keep that spirit alive that we have the Obaid Siddiqi chair at NCBS. And of course, I will not keep you too much longer for you to hear about the kind of work that's being done in that chair professorship, particularly Samira this year and so on. So again, on behalf of NCBS, welcome all of you, and over to Deepika now, who's going to tell us about the archives at NCBS.
Thank you to all of you for coming in here today. A really big thank you to the team at BIC, to Anupama, Sandhya, Saraswati, all of the tech staff here today. Thanks so much for making it possible for us to collaborate on holding the Siddiqi lectures this year. My name is Deepika. I'm a part of the team at the archives at NCBS. We are a public collecting center for the history of science in contemporary India, which means that we actively seek out and preserve material across all fields of science and from across the country. We preserve photos, letters, documents, scientific instruments, and other kinds of artifacts from individual scientists, organizations, from people's movements, and much more, and in fields ranging from aquaculture to public health and particle physics. In the coming year, our focus is on histories of science in the Karnataka region. And if you have material or have leads or for material that you think belongs in an archive, we'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to learn more about us, please do visit the archives website, archives.ncbs.res.in, or come over and visit us in person. We love having visitors. We're located in Sahakar Nagar. We are open to the public from Monday to Friday, from 10:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. And if you'd like to join our mailing list to know about what we're up to, including events like this, there's a sign-up sheet on the table just outside this room. I'd like to tell you a little about the position of the Obaid Siddiqi Chair. It's named after Obaid Siddiqi, the renowned biologist whose sustained vision led to the development and the founding of NCBS. The chair is supported by the TNQ Foundation, and every year the chair is awarded to a distinguished scholar with a substantial body of work that deepens our understanding of the history and culture of science. They are known for transcending disciplinary boundaries in their work and engaging with the public. And they also work closely with the archives at NCBS to reimagine the role of the archive in both academic and public spaces. This year, Professor Samira Sheikh rounds out her time as chair, and it's been a truly wonderful year with her, with this lecture series that has been sharp, exciting, and insightful in so many ways. And I guess the audience here, I see loads of people from the first and second lectures as well, and it's so exciting to have everyone here for this. I will hand over to Venkat Srinivasan, who heads the archives at NCBS, to tell you a bit more about Samira and her work.
Thank you. Promise, I'm the last guy before Samira speaks. It is really my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker and a dear friend for this evening. Samira Sheikh is Associate Professor of History at Vanderbilt University, and this year she is served as the 5th Obaid Siddiqi Chair in the History and Culture of Science at the Archives at NCBS. Her work has long been concerned with histories that emerge from below and from the margins. Her major work has focused on Gujarat from the 15th to the 18th centuries, asking how regions are made through people's movements, languages, and memories. Across her scholarship, she has returned to the question of how large political and cultural formations are built from the ground up. During her year at NCBS, Samira has brought this sensibility to a wide range of public and scholarly activities. As part of these activities, she developed and led the Historian in the House series, which invited the NCBS community and the wider public into historical conversations about epics, animals, oceans, land, power, and most importantly, evidence. She also introduced Fragments from the Archive, a series that we hope to continue in the coming years, a series that helped draw material from the archives at NCBS into broader conversations about knowledge, memory, and the public life of science. In February earlier this year, she organized Lines of Power, Mapping, Measurement, and the Making of Indian Spaces, a 2-day workshop at NCBS that brought together over 70 map enthusiasts from across Bangalore and further. The workshop also asked how mapping and measurement have shaped Indian spaces across many scales, from fields and forests to pilgrimage routes, legal boundaries, scientific institutions, and empires. I think I did a quick count. There were at least a dozen different disciplines represented in that audience at the workshop in February. These Obaid Siddiqi lectures bring together these strands of her work: Gujarat, maps, science, archives, and the histories of knowledge from the ground up. For more than 2 decades, Samira has worked on pre-modern and early modern maps of South Asia. Her research asks what maps were, how they worked, who made them, and how we should understand forms of spatial knowledge that do not always resemble modern cartography. In this series, of which we've already had 2 lectures, she asks why early modern Indian maps have been overlooked, what it would take to see them properly, and how they might change the histories we tell about science power and space in South Asia. She's also managed to don the hat of institution building earlier this year, diving into an inspiring archival project in Baroda. We're very, very proud to have Samira join our growing cult of archivists in India. The chair and the archives together, as Deepika mentioned, form a foundational lab to inquire and experiment across the history and culture of science, and they hopefully trying to co-create a space that holds with care and probes our collective memory of science at every register. The lab is steered by people with different people coming together with different skills, and I just want to wrap by saying something which does need to be said. Samira has somehow managed in this one short year to develop individual friendships, meaningful conversations and relationships with archivists, with scientists, with students, with the broader Bangalore community, while also finding a space for professional engagement. I'm not entirely sure how she's done this, but it is to her credit entirely. It has been a year filled with research, readings, and reflections, with laughter, travel, and warmth. Thanks so much for spending the year with us here in Bangalore. with us at NCBS, and of course, most importantly, with the team at the archives. We look forward to your lecture and continued research and banter in equal measure. The floor is yours.
Looks like the spotlight is mine, and I should say, hello, Bangalore. For the first time, I can't see the audience, so I'm just going to have to assume that everyone's smiling at me. Thank you, Venkat. Thank you to the archives at NCBS. This has been an incredible year, and I'm so grateful to have spent it with you. I've really loved being in Bangalore. Invite me back. Give me a job here. It's a wonderful place. And for those of you who haven't been to the archives at NCBS, you need to fix that very soon. And there's a lot of the archives team in the audience. Please single them out and fix up a time to go and see the archives. It's a truly extraordinary place. It's nestled within, as Shashi said, the premier institute for the study of biology. And it's run by, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, the memory keepers of Indian science. And Indian science defined in its most expansive form. So do go check it out and check out the website and come and support all the work that the archives does. Okay, so I'm going to drag you back to the 18th century. In my first two lectures, I asked what 18th century India looked like when viewed through maps that were made in India. And this is something that I've been working on for now over 20 years. Thank you. It goes back to a map that I started exploring when I was doing my PhD many, many years ago. And that will feature in today's talk as well. Why work on maps, and why use them as a lens to think about history? And I think this talk is going to be an attempt to answer that kind of broad and fundamental question. So in my first talk, I started with this kind of apparent absence of Mughal maps of the Mughal era. Whenever I would meet a map enthusiast, I would say, are you aware of any old maps, whether it's of Karnataka or Bangalore? And typically the answer would be, yes, I do have old maps. I have seen old maps. And then when I asked further about who made the maps, invariably the answer would be Europeans. And in fact, I've often had conversations where folks have said that Indians didn't really make maps. They made paintings, or they made these kind of very inexact drawings. And it's partly been that has impelled me to go look for the maps that structured the spatial worlds of Indians in the past. If we think of maps not just as objects which have scale, which have directionality, which have latitude, longitude, if we open our definition of maps to mappings as activities, we then realize that Indians in the pre-colonial era were constantly engaged in mappings. And so the burden of my first talk was to suggest that we've been looking for early modern maps in the wrong places. If we change the word maps to mappings, then we realize there is a world of mappings out there, mappings that both reflected and structured the worlds that they came out of. What is more, once we start looking for and looking at mappings, we realize that mappings included measurements, naming, walking, sailing, painting, counting, remembering and assembling information connected to land, sea, and sky. And once you open out that archive, you realize that there is an extraordinary variety that's present primarily in the 18th century, and after that, from the 19th century, that archive of non-European mapping starts to shrink. In the second lecture, I followed a map maker from Gujarat called Sadanand Vyas, who was active in the 1770s and 80s. And I followed one graphical device that he introduced for the first time in a map made by an Indian, the dotted line. I asked what changed when he introduces the dotted line into an Indian map. What I suggested was that overlapping political relationships of tribute that might be owed, villages that might have to be assessed for the tax, forts that were occupied by one power or another, those began to be translated into bounded territories on a flat plane. And I suggested that the line makes jurisdictions portable, reproducible, and eventually legally actionable. And that's what eventually results in international boundaries, but also boundaries between states that we all live within. And I wanted to suggest that this flowering of mappings in 18th century India came to be supplanted largely by European-style mappings in the course of the 19th century, including as a consequence of the Great Trigonometric Survey, which, as I'm sure many of this audience knows, started right here in Bangalore. And European cartography becomes dominant partly because it went hand in hand with European or British expansion into much of India. And so in consonance with the army, with the courts, with the insertion of print into map making, one cartographic language, that of the lat-long grid, that of the scale, that of sort of familiar European style mapping that we all know and are very used to, that becomes what is a map. And no other kind of map is then admissible as a map. So today what I'm going to try and do is take that argument one step further. I want to suggest that in the 18th century, this dispersal and this huge flowering of mappings that takes place, and this graph kind of shows you that mappings were, at least from this preliminary stage of our knowledge, still relatively infrequent in the 17th and 16th centuries, and relatively infrequent when authored by Indians in the 19th. But the 18th century sees this huge flowering of mappings. So what kind of India did those lines on the map, those dotted lines that are introduced after Sadanand, what kind of India do those increasingly authoritative lines teach us to imagine? What happened to the forms of spatial knowledge that political maps could not contain? And what might 18th century maps reveal about representing networks without total and complete centralization? Let's move to the 18th century. And Aurangzeb died in 1707. After that, the Mughal Empire starts to dissipate, at least in terms of its political and its military power. These are just some of the rulers of the 18th century who you may be familiar with. I think Tipu is, of course, someone very familiar for this audience. This was a period in which, while Mughal military power was weakening, power is redistributed among scores, if not hundreds, of regional rulers, chiefs, military entrepreneurs, merchants, officials, and of course, the various East India companies. This is a time by the we all know our school history after the battles of Plassey and Buxar. The East India Company consolidates its hold in Bengal, but that power in the 18th century remains far from complete. It's still very much layered and negotiated. And despite the sort of increasing military control of the East India Company, there is still very much a veneer of Mughal cultural authority that remains throughout most of South Asia, Mughals' titles, offices, revenue categories, and courtly forms. Now, it's sometimes a little hard for us to imagine histories without empires. It's easier when you've got a flat block of color, which tells you Aurangzeb ruled almost the whole of India. This map completely flattens all the negotiations, all the sub-imperial kingdoms and viceroyalties. And this kind of map may tell us that the Mughals were in charge, but it doesn't tell us the full story of the 18th century. So we've got so used to seeing maps with these hard lines around them that it's very hard for us to imagine what a map would look like which had divided and layered sovereignties. And we tend to call periods of those divided and layered sovereignties periods of fragmentation, decline, or chaos. But what I want to suggest is that the 18th century is a time of huge commercial expansion, military and technical experimentation, including right here in Karnataka, a lot of mobility, and changing markets for information. You've got very active surveyors, accountants, maritime pilots, scribes, painters, monks, metal workers, hereditary officials. As the ground is being reformulated around them, this is a time when people are reformulating the ways in which they can represent that change in knowledge. So there was, in parts of India, a degree of social mobility and even a certain degree of negotiability in caste in the 18th century because of this radical decentralization of power. Now, because of this decentralization, because of these dozens and dozens of kingdoms and little chieftaincies and little principalities, knowledge does not travel upwards any longer to an imperial center. It doesn't get translated any longer into Mughal workshops or large imperial or military projects. Rather, it starts to move horizontally. It starts to move horizontally through new networks and new channels by which people learn to learn from each other and learn to communicate with each other. So I'm going to suggest in this talk that mappings of the decentralized 18th century reflect the changing politics of the time and suggest even that they may offer options for our own present moment. And further, I ask, what kinds of social and political order become visible when we let go of the assumption that there has to be only one singular kind of mapping, that control and knowledge must accrue only from one center? So we tend to think of certain kinds of knowledge being the preserve of the state. Currency notes, for instance. We all concede that passports, Aadhaar cards, that these should be given a certain degree of uniformity by the state. These should be immediately recognizable as emblems of the state in any context. There are certain symbols we've all become accustomed to as associated with the nation, the Ashokan lions, the image of Gandhi, and many, many others. But there's a certain uniformity in emblems of the state. But in the past few decades, we've also become very comfortable with a lack of uniformity in certain aspects of things that were formerly controlled entirely by the state. So for instance, we're completely used to having multiple commercial airlines when there used to be only one national carrier. We're very used to different UPI services when there used to be only one form of currency, that of notes and coins. But despite the fact that you might have GPay on your phone and you might have Paytm, you know that those systems speak to one another. They are undergirded by a common knowledge system. And that's what I mean by commensurability. I mean by commensurability, the ability to translate between different systems well enough for information to travel, to be compared, and to become usable. Commensurability did not require a standardization of maps or of mappings, but it did require a certain degree of recognizability, that this is the same system. It may take different forms, but there's certain aspects of it that recur throughout that knowledge system. It required enough of a shared grammar, shall we call it, for sailors, surveyors, officials, patrons, and painters to communicate with one another. So let's look at some examples of what I'm trying to communicate here. Here is the gateway drug for me. This is the map I was sent when I was doing my PhD, and someone asked me to try and identify it and figure out what it said. And I spent almost a year of procrastination time working it out. And it kind of gave me a fascination with maps that I absolutely did not have before. And I've come back to it after more than 20 years to try and expand and kind of deepen the project. Now, what is this? This is a map of the Gulf of Cambay. Here you see Surat, here you see Cambay, and here you see the Gulf. And this is a map which is accompanied by a few pages of text, which the pages of text include sailing directions from Diu to Surat, along the Red Sea, from the mouth of the Red Sea to Jeddah, and 3 pages of a list of ports, about 100 ports with their stellar altitudes, which is their, the angle of the port with respect to the pole star, which is effectively the latitude. And I found when I did the study of this little manuscript that the pole star altitudes that had been calculated in the 1730s were within 0.5% of being of closeness to their contemporary measurements. So this was a very exciting little manuscript for me to work on. And here's where I'd like to share with you take a moment to stare at it. It's rather fascinating. So you've got the map here of the Gulf, and here you've got a page of sailing instructions from Diu to Surat. And here's the territory you see in English. And what you see here is that the sailing instructions tell you that if you are traveling from Diu towards Surat, you must keep taking your bearings in the Gulf of Cambay because there are sandbanks and you don't want your ship to run aground. So be very careful, keep taking your bearings in the form of fathoms. Now, how do you negotiate getting around those sandbanks, making your way, kind of getting across them and then making your way up the coast? And there you have directions which are stellar directions, which are directions to navigate through astral objects. And I was very excited just last week to find that Dr. B.S. Shailaja, who's former director of the Nehru Planetarium here, was able to interpret the directions that are in the text in the form of interpreting what these little symbols in this tiny little diagram represent. So you see these little dots here and these numbers here. Basically, it's that little diagram is telling you keep taking bearings along these numbers 18, 18, and 19, but travel towards these particular stars. So you move towards Chitra and then you turn towards Khatpand, and Khaval should be on your, okay, let me read this properly. It matches the text instructing the pilot to steer towards the rising of a star or asterism called Khaval. So that's where you're going. And here it tells you, there's a little letter U, which tells you this is the rising Khaval. There will also be the setting asterism, which has a different symbol. So you go towards the rising Khaval, then you go towards Chitra, which is Spika, and then you go towards the pole star, that's Dhruv. So what is happening over here is that the pilot negotiates multiple systems simultaneously. Stars rising at particular points on the horizon, the changing depth and the character of the sea, visible coastal landmarks, remembered hazards, and instructions that are transmitted not only in writing, but presumably orally as well. Now let's look at another wonderful map, and this is a map of the Red Sea from a slightly later period, and it is now in the Royal Geographical Society in London. And this maps the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. And despite the fact that it's more colorful, it has boats in it, it's got these shoreline silhouettes, despite the fact that there's a lot of difference from the map that I showed you, there are still a lot of recognizable similarities. Here again, you see lines which tell you how to navigate with respect to a star or an asterism. Here you see how the shorelines are depicted with stippling to show sandbanks or difficult lands. And you see the silhouette of the shoreline as a seafarer would and when they encounter the coastline. Here's another image from the same map. And then the more you dig, you realize that many of these star symbols were actually standardized through much of Western India. And this is a slide from Professor B. Arunachalam's work, which shows how the symbols for different stars were pretty much standard. There was a commensurability here which went across regional borders, at least on the western coast. You see here also these star roses or star compasses, which would tell you in which direction you should expect to see particular stars. You see here how Diu would be, you have instruction for sailing around Diu, and this is from a manuscript from 1663. It's the oldest maritime manuscript that exists, and it's in the National Museum in Delhi. And it tells you how to navigate around Diu using, again, stellar directions, but also other kinds of points and calculations that are available. So this knowledge, I should say, does not become public. It's not published. Of course, printing is not introduced in India till very late in the 18th century. It's not made available to people outside the user communities. And that's because the user community needs this knowledge in order to preserve their commercial advantage. So, but nevertheless, there is a degree of commensurability across Western India in terms of these forms and these knowledges that were ostensibly fairly secret and fairly carefully controlled. So let's now look at the problem of routes and how to travel in India and acquire the necessary information that you needed to get from one place to another. Now, this becomes a graphic problem for map makers to solve. How to depict routes in the most economical way possible so that travelers are not burdened by, vast kind of maps or scrolls or whatever, that this information be depicted with the least amount of fuss possible, right? So all these mappings, many of these mappings from the 18th century feature this kind of economy of information. They don't give you more than is required. These are not accretive maps. They give you just what you need, what that specific community or user needs. And so again, this shared, this kind of question of the graphic representation of often very long distances is solved in different ways, but again with a degree of commensurability within them. And despite the fact that there doesn't seem to be overt connections between these forms of mappings. So this is a map from the City Palace Museum in Jaipur, which has been overlaid with interpretations of the routes within that by my colleague Taksh Sangwan. And here these red lines represent the routes, or there's various place names, and then there's distances between those place names. So what you're seeing here is Ajmer and Ahmedabad, and the Aravallis between them. And so this route map gives you the basic information you need to get from one station to another, and also to negotiate often very difficult terrain in the form of the mountains. So it tells you in places that the dharti vikat, that the land is difficult, so keep that in mind. And this is a fascinating product, again very early from the 1680s. Here are a couple of close-ups of this map. And you see here that there are place names in both the Nastaliq script in Persian as well as in Devanagari. You see a certain familiarity of depicting places, often in the form of these doubled lines, which suggests that a town or a village is fortified. There is a wall around it. And very often there are also gates depicted within these depictions. And here what you're seeing is that this says Panch Kos. So the kos is the measure of distance that is used to explicate how much time you should expect to go from on the road before you encounter a point of friction, a town, a resting place, a mountain, a river, and so on. Let's look again at a couple more route maps. Here is a route map of northwestern India, including of the entire region from Kabul to Rajasthan. And this is now in the National Archives, and it's been annotated heavily by some English person later on. So there's both English and Persian in the map. But once again, you have this kind of a lot of these, in this case, rectangular place names, but also interspersed with distances that are between them. You see larger places are indicated again with these double lines suggesting fortification or walls. And you're seeing, again, the points of friction include mountains and in some cases rivers and other natural features. This map, this beautifully painted scroll map, also from the 18th century, gives you the route again from Kabul to Delhi. And it shows, once again, in a more painterly form, the depiction of these double lines. But in this case, you see the depiction of gates. So your point of friction in this kind of landscape is you're going along the route, carrying your goods, or if you're a ascetic or a muni, or you're going to visit family, or you're going on pilgrimage, you're chugging along just fine. And then there are places where you will either seek shelter, or you would have to pay some sort of taxes. So those points of friction are often towns or villages where you would have to enter through the gates and then exit through presumably another gate. So those gates, again, are indicated in this kind of economy of showing you what you need to know for the journey. But also, they will show you some of the topographical features, sometimes the animals you will encounter. So it's often kind of accompanied by information that may want you to, like if you're going to buy a scroll for the journey in the market, maybe you want a beautiful map to carry. And so there are elements that often provoke affect as well. But they don't have to. Sometimes they're very functional, sometimes they are quite embellished. But again, there's a sort of commensurability in the kind of visual language that's going on over here. Now, you've got the question then of how to depict cities. And again, through the course of the 18th century, many different versions of city depictions are coming up. And I'm just going to show you two, which are one from the 18th and one from the 19th century. But you see again how the language of commensurability means that these two maps made by two different patrons still have a kind of common visual vocabulary in terms of how they organize space. So both are from a bird's eye view. They are city plans. In this is a detail from a much larger Mughal map, which I'll get to in a minute. You see a lot of attention to how the river frames the city. You see the citadel of the fort depicted very carefully, and all the gates of Ahmedabad are carefully indicated. You also are given a lot of detail about the various neighborhoods and localities within the citadel and around, as well as the water bodies that surround the city. And let's look now at this map made 60 or 70 years later. And once again, you see that there's attention to the citadel, there's attention to the water, there's the rectangular place notations, attention to religious architecture, and so on. So while there are, these are quite different, and I've spent some time sort of figuring out how they're different, how we can kind of compare them, but there's also a certain visual language that is pretty much similar. Let's get to a map that I spent some time exploring in the first of this series. And this is a very large map made before 1750, presumably in Ahmedabad, and presumably commissioned by the last Mughal governor of the province of Gujarat. You get a sense of its scale here. It's almost 4.5 by 4 meters. And I was able to assemble an incredible team of experts to go and study this back in March. Thank you to NCBS for making this possible. And this map, here's the whole thing. This map is most legible when it has east on top. So I'm going to need you to turn your heads to orient yourself to what is a customary way now of seeing maps, which is with north on top. So that's north. This is the Gulf of Cambay. This is the Saurashtra Kathiawar Peninsula. Here is Kutch. Here is parts of Rajasthan. And here are the mountains that border, that form the border between Madhya Pradesh and Gujarat. So let's just spend a moment looking at this map again for those of you who have seen it before. And here I have oriented it with north on top, just to give you a sense of how the peninsula looks. There's the Gulf of Cambay. And here's a way of, just a way for you to see how different towns within Gujarat are depicted, again, with elaborations of the same commensurate vocabulary. So this is how Surat is depicted, once again, with with gates and citadel carefully shown. Here's the port of Cambay. Now here is Junagadh and Girnar, and I'll come back to these in a few minutes. Here you see the city of Junagadh depicted in a conventional way, bird's eye view, fort, gates. But Girnar is depicted as though you were a pilgrim approaching it from a pilgrim's eye view, right? So there's two different perspectives that are coexisting within this map, and that is perfectly normal. And that is because this obeys the conventions of a pilgrim map, while this obeys the conventions of a city plan. Yeah, and so that commensurability has to be achieved within these two visualizations. Here you see the city of Patan, and here this is a little bit different. It's shown with in kind of a circular form with the multiple routes or roads within it. Here you see the ports along the coastline, and these are depicted as double circles, but again, almost invariably with the point of entry, the gate of entry that you would need. You would need that information to visualize it. You also see a certain standardization, and I talked about this during my first lecture, of emerging conventions of how to show political or administrative units. So there's no dotted lines yet, but you certainly have attention to, is this a pargana, in other words, a revenue district, or is this a mauza, which is just a small little village or small town? Yeah? Is this a port? Is this a fort? All of that information is indicated both in the visualization of that little, the vignette, but also in the text. So one of the things I've been trying to do is to, when you've got a lot of diversity of mappings, you've got mappings of different genres. I've just shown you two, route maps and maritime maps, but you've got dozens of genres. How do you evolve a methodology that does justice to them, but also doesn't flatten them into something that they are not? As in, doesn't assess them by, is this close enough to an accurate map or not? Yeah? So one of the ways I've been trying to do this is to evolve a kind of analytical stack, which tries to think about the different elements or layers within a map and to assess each of those on its own terms, assuming that each layer may or may not come from a different source, right? So for instance, the city plan may come from the city plan. It may come from a plan made of Ahmedabad, and that has been incorporated into the giant map that I just showed you. The hydrology, however, the water, the Sabarmati and the irrigation facilities shown in the map might come from another concern altogether, which is the maybe the Mughal governor wants has people who indicate this village has a well, that village has a tank, this village is close to a river, and so irrigation is taken from perhaps a different source. We may also see that, so I'm suggesting that this kind of analytical stack of looking at hydrology, looking at toponyms, place names, looking at chromatic layers, the color systems within a map, looking at the consistency within a particular layer. Like, is the water depicted in a consistent way throughout the map or not? Rather than, so trying to get away from questions of accuracy to questions of consistency. Can we think of the material with which it is made? Is there consistency within that? Is this made on paper? And so therefore, is it similar to other paper maps? Is it made on cloth? And is it therefore similar to other cloth maps? Looking at modes of construction, modes of making, materials with which these maps are made. So this 14-part analytical stack, I'm hoping, will give me the resources to be able to compare like with like, and to avoid both the presentism and the risk of trying to impose present concerns of accuracy of data onto maps that for which that was not the purpose. Yeah. So one way, let me illustrate that with a couple of quick examples. Now, in this giant map, the city of Ahmedabad is way, way, way out of scale for our contemporary eyes. But it is a convention in much of manuscript painting that the importance of a figure, so for instance, the patron or the king in a painting is often depicted as being larger than the other figures. So the size of Ahmedabad in this map, the outsized nature of Ahmedabad, is an index of its stature, its status within the map. The margins of the map may suggest that the genre has shifted from a city plan to something else. It may suggest that the source base for that particular map came from folklore. It came from religion. It came from a place which says that Girnar is a place of pilgrimage and therefore of a lot of religious sanctity for Jains, Hindus, and Muslims. And so let's depict it in the way that is appropriate to that particular site. We also, for instance, so you see the sacred mountain here, which may be positioned through pilgrimage significance. And so what looks at first sight like inconsistency, why is one part shown as a city plan, one part shown as a pilgrimage map, that begins to acquire a coherence and an intelligibility because you start to see how they all function within the flat plane and reflect and visualize the genre that they come from, right? So the analytical stack gives me a way to assess the source base of the map. If Girnar is depicted as a site of pilgrimage, perhaps the information about Girnar comes from pilgrimage manuals or from pilgrims. Now, this kind of map does not erase its sources. It doesn't flatten its sources. It retains the genres from which its information comes. We don't always know how to interpret that information, but maybe this analytical annotation stack will help us disaggregate some of those layers and make them intelligible to us again. But it certainly makes these different genres commensurable so that they can exist within a singular plane and make a unified statement about the prosperity and the pleasure and the grandeur, as it were, of Gujarat. Now, this map was made before 1750. Yeah, this is right before Gujarat is captured by the Marathas. The East India Company has already got strongholds in both Surat and Cambay and is very much trying to make inroads into the rest of Gujarat. 20-odd years later, after this map, comes Sadanand Vyas, who those of you who were here on, who were with me on Thursday will remember Sadanand Vyas's map. Now, if the earlier map, the large Mughal map, was commissioned by the last Mughal governor of Gujarat, Ali Muhammad Khan, who also wrote a gazetteer of Gujarat called the Mirat-e-Ahmadi, which includes its history, its topography, its products, its revenues, you know, this huge compendium of information about Gujarat. And current thinking is that the map went along with that gazetteer. Now, if that was one huge knowledge project from the early 1750s, what Sadanand does is quite different, and this is in the 1780s. Ali Muhammad Khan does not sign the map. There is no mention of authorship within the Mughal map. neither he nor any one individual controlled all the information that went into the making of the map. Rather, what that map did was bring together textile workers, painters, scribes, administrators to create this giant and multi-genre visualization of Gujarat. And that kind of might help us imagine the workshop which constituted and created that map. But that map, the Mughal map, and let's go back to it maybe. The Mughal map cannot be reducible on lines of community. Because there's no singular authorship, because it is clearly derived from multiple genres of both information and expertise, it can't be divided neatly into, well, this part is Hindu science, that part is Jain astronomy, this part is Muslim navigation, this part is European cartography. You simply can't think of it in those terms. You have to think of it as a common technical project in which a variety of technical problems were both posed and solved in a language that was commensurable and comprehensible to whoever the audience might be, probably Gujarati elites. So in that sense, this Gujarat map of the 1750s serves as a historical model of how commensurability works. It functions as a node of that commensurability. It doesn't flatten every practice into one standard form. Rather, it creates a surface in which different forms of knowledge could be brought into relation with one another. And therefore, it allows us to see a late Mughal political ecology. So let's go back now to Sadanand and his map, which I just showed you for a second. Now, Sadanand gives us a very different way of knowing Gujarat. Now, Ali Muhammad Khan, after the fall of Ahmedabad, flees to Cambay. Sadanand seems to have lived all his life in Cambay. Chances are he may have seen the map before. He may have had access to its data. Certainly, he puts in a lot of data into his map, a lot more data, especially in terms of toponyms. So if the Mughal map had 100 odd toponyms, this has over 400. He also pays attention to administrative categories, measurements, routes, but he puts all of this into a lat-long grid and to a form that kind of flattens where the sources of his information comes from and flattens it into a singular genre in which he presents his information. And so the dotted lines that he puts into his work that bound the different sub-regions of Gujarat, they turn these kind of negotiated areas that are not shown in any previous map into these polygons which have kind of physical form. Lines are literally being drawn in the sand. Now, one way to think about Sadanand and his extraordinary map, which includes a lot of topographical detail, 400 place names, the lat-long grid, and the place names are placed accurately according to his lat-long grid in terms of he's able to take bearings in order to fit every single 400 odd places into the right places. And these are the dotted lines which constitute these sub-regions. What he also does is put in a scale bar, again a very familiar European device, and a compass rose to give you cardinal directions, in this time with north very unambiguously being on top. He also, and we talked about this a little bit on Thursday, he signs his map. He says in the cartouche, Tat pato yam gurjara dharitra yaha kritaha vyasa sadanandena. This map of the territory of Gujarat was made by Vyas Sadanand. And he made it in a way that even children could understand. Even those who are learning the alphabet could understand. And this can be interpreted as a dig at his British friends who commissioned this map. But what I want us to think about a little bit more is what are the implications of Sadanand signing his map with what may also be a self-portrait. Why is he placing himself so unambiguously within this map, saying, I am the author of this map, and I have made it in a way that both shows my mastery over this territory, but also shows that I can translate that mastery into something even children or Englishmen can understand. So he is engaging, I think, in a project of centralization. He is centering political space by placing territories upon one gridded plane, and he centers knowledge upon his own person in the figure of a very distinctly caste-marked person. So I, the learned Brahmin, am creating this knowledge, I am collating this knowledge, and I'm making it available to those of little understanding. And that's the transition I want to notice today. From a provincial map assembled through dispersed expertise and multiple genres, to a map that presents Gujarat through the authority of a singular caste-marked translator. The lines he puts into the map make territory visible, and the signature tells us who claims the right to adjudicate that information. Okay, I'm going to sum up now. I want us to think about perhaps a broader political question. If shared conventions, as I've tried to suggest, if shared conventions could rise through dispersed networks and commensurable information, then what is the point of a political center? Most of 18th century India did not have a political center until the British conquer much of the subcontinent. In our current day, a central authority may establish basic rights, common legal standards, redistribute resources between richer and poorer nations, provide defense and infrastructure, offer a final forum for disputes, or protect people from tyranny. But centralization also enlarges the scale of coercion. The same institutions can standardize classification, but they can also erase local rights. They can impose compulsory identities. You belong on one side of the line or another. And they can convert complex, layered, situated relationships into files and points on a map. So I do want to suggest that the 18th century gives us some sort of a virtuous past, opposed to a very highly corrupt and centralized present. But I'm suggesting that it gives us attention. While common rules may be necessary, but coordination, commensurability does not always require total informational centralization. How much common authority is required for justice to prevail, and how much autonomy can democracy sustain? How much information is a state entitled to demand from those it governs? In the 19th and 20th centuries, cadastral surveys, that's surveys of land parcels for the purposes of taxing them, made Sadanand's dotted lines much more refined, much more accurate, much more connected with ownership, the market, productivity, rent, and liability. In the process, forest, grazing, fishing, water rights were often pushed to the wayside. And political and administrative lines reallocated and hardened the application of law resources, and identity, and eventually in post-colonial India of citizenship. Now, a world without political lines is the world before Sadanand. But it's not a world without boundaries. There were always boundaries. Boundaries are carried in persons. Porous jurisdictions could coexist with restrictions on mobility. And I also don't want to suggest that somehow that the 18th century's networks of knowledge were somehow egalitarian. Caste, gender, occupation, status, all of those were very much part of determining who could travel, who had what kinds of freedoms, who could enter what kinds of spaces. But nevertheless, the decentralized landscape of the 18th century allowed for technical knowledge to cross the barriers with which we now classify identity. Towards the end of the 18th century, I've tried to suggest that Sadanand makes knowledge that was previously opaque. He makes it legible, he makes it visible. And at the same time, he claims the status of the learned Brahmin as its authoritative interpreter. Now, we all carry social information in our bodies and in our persons: caste, gender, religion, occupation, age, all of that defines our spatial location within wherever we are. Shapes where you can travel, what thresholds you can cross, what areas might bring danger or humiliation. Now, that is not information that you will find in your phone map. You will not find information whether you, as an individual, have access to a sacred site or to a privileged location like this one. It may calculate distance precisely, but it doesn't record the knowledge that your subjectivity requires to navigate the space around you. And that's where that tension is, from where I get I suggested the title Secrets and Lines. Secrets recalls the tacit forms of spatial organization that modern maps omit. These could include affect, caste, gender, danger. Older mappings may encode and reflect such forms, which later cartographies omit. When lines are made visible, they become official cartographic boundaries. Yet the older spatial worlds do not disappear entirely with the coming of the dotted line, of course. Pilgrimage maps still were made, route maps were still made, and a lot of maps were made, but those were not given the status of being in any form. They weren't even considered maps. They were considered paintings or renderings or visualizations. They lost the status of the map. So what then is the purpose for me to spend this afternoon talking to you about pre-colonial maps? What use is this exercise? And from my perspective, what I'm trying to suggest is careful, rigorous, and technical analysis of such maps could help enlarge the range of political forms through which we can imagine our present. 18th century, there was a lot of bad stuff happening. Unequal, extractive, violent, all of that. But knowledge and coordination could emerge and be transmitted along dispersed nodes. People could remain very attached to a city, a language, a landscape, a community, while also remaining mobile along them and being able to communicate with others. That tells us also something about our own political imagination. We've been trained to recognize India most readily when there is a singular political authority that fills our maps. I want you to imagine Bangalore as more than just a polygon, a shape within Karnataka that is within India. What if we were to think of Bangalore as a node of overlapping webs of Kannada and other language worlds, scientific, technical, artistic communities, religious and familial networks, migrant histories, watersheds, neighborhoods, commercial routes. The list can go on. The political map, the map we have on our phones, the cadastral map, only records one dimension of our city, but it can't encompass or exhaust its spatial life. Recovering older mappings allows us to distinguish coordination from total centralization and common rights from uniform identities. It asks how much legibility a democratic state truly needs and how much mobility, plurality, and even opacity its citizens require and should demand. Old mappings establish that the present arrangement that we live in is historically contingent. Other spatial imaginations have existed and will exist in the future. Our task now is to decide which of these imaginations enlarge human possibility, which reproduce exclusion, and which might help us create a political world that is capacious enough for attachment, movement, memory, and difference. Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy to take questions.
If anyone has a question, kindly raise your hand and I'll bring the mic around.
Professor Sheikh, this is a very plebeian question. In one of your first maps, the navigation map of Cambay from St. John's, Oxford, I wondered if the directions that were put on that map were made using something like a sextant, whether those pilots had access to those kinds of instruments. And if I may, a second question, since you're a historian of Gujarat, is there any basis to believing that the Roma moved from Gujarat and Rajasthan to Europe?
I'll pass on the second question. It's out of my area of expertise, but I believe there are linguistic connections which suggest long patterns of migration. The first question, yes, absolutely. The answer is yes. I didn't even talk about the kind of instrumentation that would go into creating not just these maps, but the ability to successfully navigate the Western Indian Ocean. These sailors would have access to some of these, the star charts, the wind charts, the directional information that I showed. They might have had access to possibly to astrolabes, certainly to quadrants, perhaps very sort of rudimentary kinds of quadrants. You just need a very simple kind of instrument which calculates your angle with respect to a particular star, a rising or a setting star. It doesn't, those were called Kamal in. What the sextant does. Yes, yes. So there was a variety of fairly simple instruments that were available and may have been carried on board ship. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. Very inspired by cartography as a student of geography. My question was about opacity, the use of the term, where we usually use transparency to establish political boundaries. Why did you choose opacity as a term?
The idea that administration should be entirely transparent comes from colonialism. It comes from the late 18th and early 19th century efforts to dismantle the kind of hierarchies that were involved in collecting revenue in India, because it was deemed that the individuals and firms who were part of these hierarchies were skimming off the revenue that the British state should have unfettered access to. So a lot of the effort of the 19th century colonial administration was to make visible and transparent the ways of the functionings of Indian society. So that, you could say on one hand that, and that still persists, that the attempts, say, in the present day by the government to make land parcel data available to anybody is a way of rooting out corruption. It's a way of rooting out abuse of the system. But what it also does, it roots out expertise. Expertise which would not necessarily be amenable to everybody knowing how that expertise works, right? So it's a complex process, but this notion of transparency as an ideal in administration, and I'm suggesting in cartography, comes from this colonial impulse to know, and to know everything legibly, and for all that legibility to be on this flat two-dimensional surface. So I'm suggesting that there may be ways of thinking about maybe not entirely two-dimensional maps, maps which have layers and that are not entirely well fitted to one another. And that allows us to see the kind of expertise that might lie in the understanding of land, in the understanding of sea, and that might not fit within the kind of state's understanding of what is the appropriate way of calculating, adjudicating, and parceling land and sea.
Thank you. Wonderful talk. I had a there have been earlier periods when there were, this what you speak of as commensurability was already the case with Ptolemaic geography, which was inherited equally by Hindu, Jains, and Buddhists as well as by the Muslim world. So there was a translatability already. You see, the Delhi Sultanate, right, which translators into Persian from Sanskrit and so forth exploit. How different is this later? Is it just a kind of difference in volume and, let's say, scale, the sheer number of, or the sheer scale of commensurability from earlier instances of this kind of commensurability, epistemic commensurability, say, especially the sort of the inheritance, a kind of a shared Babylonian inheritance of the Ptolemaic cosmology?
I'm using commensurability here to distinguish between forms of centralization where imperial interests try to kind of scoop up knowledge systems and turn them to their own ends. Certainly, even in Indian history, there have been multiple periods of decentered, networked nodes. And another period where, which I've spent a lot of time thinking about, is the 15th century, where you again see so much of the landscape of India, especially northern and western India, that you see in the Mughal map that I showed you, is a product of the 15th century, when a lot of drastic urbanization is taking place and a lot of new forts and towns are coming into being. And that is still what shapes our spatial reality now. Now that is as a product not of Mughal centralization, which very much privileged agrarian revenues. It's a product of decentralization, which privileges urbanization. So if we are to think of the Ptolemaic legacy, that has percolated in multiple ways through different nodes and networks of history. In India, we see the Ptolemaic heritage coming through most beautifully in an atlas made in 1647 during Shah Jahan's period. But that seems to be more of an imperial project and not really a product of the kind of networks I'm talking about. But thank you.
Navigating with the stars seems to have been a kind of Indian specialty to some extent. I was wondering, some of the Western people like Vasco da Gama apparently had Indian sailors on board who navigated for them. Could you say a bit about that? Would they have had access to these maps, or were these maps really objects only in the court, not for ordinary sailors and merchants? The relationship of, I guess, Western sailing to Indian knowledge.
The story goes, and this is told by one of Vasco's biographers, that Vasco meets a Gujarati Muslim pilot in Malindi, I think it is. And there's one version of the story that says they sat up drinking and chatting all night, and the next morning the Gujarati pilot agreed to pilot him across the Arabian Sea. So yes, it's pretty well attested that there was expertise of Indian sailors in that voyage, and possibly many more after that. But it's certainly not true that Indians were the only ones who navigated by the stars. There was this kind of understanding of latitude. For instance, this sailing on fixed bearings, dead reckoning. Once you hit a particular latitude and you just sail, keep taking your latitude with respect to the pole star, but you keep staying on that latitude, you will eventually, if you're going from east to west or west to east, you will eventually hit the shore on the other end. And then you can make your way north or south to your destination as you need to. But that's a very sort of common and universal feature of using the pole star in the northern hemisphere to find your bearings. The entire kind of the world of cosmological but also astronomical calculation, there is a lot of networked dissemination of that along routes of sea and bars along the coastline that is happening, from very early periods onwards. And so a lot of this seafaring knowledge, even if seafarers were like, this is the guy who's the best at navigating, and he has the secrets of really interpreting the stars, but there would still be a baseline knowledge that would be common, whether it's Islamic world navigators, East African navigators, European navigators, or Indian navigators. They would share a certain language which would be commensurable, and increasingly became more commensurable after the 15th century.
To your left, right in the front. Right, your left.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. So I was fascinated by this contrast between the earlier maps and then Sutherland's maps. And in the earlier ones, what's so clear is this affect, this idea that you belong to a place, and therefore Ahmedabad is much bigger, and so on. In Sutherland's maps, he marks himself out and he names himself as the Brahmin and puts his face there. And it seems as though he's highlighting his skill, the skill of scale and so on and so forth. But what are the kinds of erasures, if we were to look at that map in contrast to other maps? Would it be that the Dalit shrines are not there, that there are certain other places of worship that are not there? So what are the ways by which one could think about affect in a map like that? I was just wondering if you may want to.
One of the most curious features of the giant Mughal map is that the largest religious shrine is not actually Girnar, is the very intriguing and not very important shrine of the goddess Bahuchara. And this is the goddess who is sacred to the trans community, to the Hijra community. She rides on a chicken, and her followers consider themselves half Hindu and half Muslim. And there's a mythology that goes into that. So that is the biggest sacred shrine shown in that giant 4.5 by 4 meter map. There are lots of little dargahs, there's lots of Jain shrines, there's lots of Hindu temples and pilgrimage sites, but that one is the biggest, and it's still a puzzle as to why. Theory is welcome. Sadanand puts no religious sites into his map, none at all. There are only place names. There is only let me see. There are only place names. There's a little bit of topographical detail by way of, here you've got the sandbanks again. You've got a few hills, you've got rivers, you've got this intriguing little line of trees here which look like palm trees. But by and large, that's the only little gestures to affect that he puts in. There are gestures to affect in the cartouche. But again, those center himself. You've got this little picturesque little temple and palm tree and tree, and you have an elephant on the other side of the cartouche, which I don't have an image of. But then the cartouche, of course, that's the affective element of this map, and that completely centers himself. There's no other religious, multi-genre mapping at all. This is a European map, except that it is in the Devanagari script, and it is made with, you know, this incredible control of skill that he has poured into it.
The last question of the evening.
Hi, thank you. I have two set of questions. The first one is to do with if we are thinking about the standards and commensurability in the 17th and 18th century, what happens if we bring the account ledgers, which are much more standard, has proper descriptive for the accountant at least. So what happens if you bring the ledger into the cartography? And I can clearly imagine an accountant sitting with the ledger, but also on the map on the side. Maybe not. That could also be the possibility. And the second thing is the maps in the 19th century. It gets scaled up, gets flat up, of course, that's one argument. But the other argument is that these maps are actually going to London. These are supposed to be portable. These are like invisibilizing the accountant world, which kind of like had this cadastral and land and revenue surveys and so on. So how do you see that remote bureaucracy from London governing India, and these maps kind of facilitating that remote governance or something like that? Yeah.
So let me try and answer that with reference to Nandini Chatterjee's work on the documents that were preserved by a family in Madhya Pradesh for many generations from the time of Shah Jahan onwards. And the kind of documents that were preserved both reinforce their status within the local community as rights holders, but also reified their rights to land. And here is where the tension between the kind of Mughal attempts to impose standardization on documentary forms pushes against the regionalization of these forms as time goes by. And one of the ways in which that Mughal documentary form, I think, is a manifestation of the drastic longevity of a Mughal cultural form, the document. That remains, in many ways, remains intact across regions and across time until the 20th century. So that, I think there's much more to be thought and said, but I think the Mughal documentary forms, the Mughal forms of land deeds with sometimes a description of land or a sketch of land, all of these documentary forms need to be considered next to these forms of mappings in order to really understand where you see the layers of continuity from Mughal imperial forms, and where you see this sort of nodes of knowledge being much more decentralized and regionally inflected. So that's, I think, the way I would look at it, but this work remains to be done. About the 19th century, well, how was it done from London? I mean, this is questions for the Matthew Edney, mapping an empire kind of work on the kind of cartography done in the 19th century. And that's really beyond where I've really thought about it. So, but thank you for that observation.
I think that brings us to a close. Could we please thank Dr. Samira Sheikh for her presentation. Thanks, of course, to the archives at NCBS for bringing this program to BIC. Thanks to all of you for joining us on a Sunday evening. Take care and good night.